They want to run your city, your school board. Eventually, they say the country. The Democrat Socialists of America, the DSA, now claims over 120,000 members, a sitting mayor of New York City, a mayor of Seattle, a presumptive mayor of Washington, D.C., and a growing bloc in the U.S. House. So tonight we're asking a simple question. Nobody in the mainstream press seems interested in asking, who exactly are these people? And have any of them ever actually run anything? A business? A budget? An economy? Let's find out. What say you? The DSA was founded in 1982, a merger of two smaller socialist groups. One descended straight from Eugene Debs's old Socialist Party, the other born out of 1960s New Left campus radicalism. For most of its history, it was a fringe organization, a few thousand members nationwide, basically a book club that occasionally protested something. Then Bernie Sanders ran for president in 2016 and DSA exploded. As of this year, membership has crossed 120,000, officially making it the largest socialist organization in American history, bigger even than Eugene Debs's Socialist Party at its 1912 peak. Congratulations, guys. You beat a 114-year-old record. Somebody get them a trophy made of recycled materials, ethically sourced, obviously. So how is it actually run? At the top sits a national political committee, 27 people who function in their own words as DSA's board of directors. 27. For a group that hates hierarchy, that's a lot of middle management. Let's start with the two people at the very top, co-chairs Ashik Siddiq and Megan Romer. Siddiq has a neuroscience degree from Wesleyan, spent years as a research coordinator on a PTSD study for combat veterans, and today works as a research analyst at a Washington think tank studying military spending. He ran for a neighborhood advisory commission seat in D.C. once. He lost to a neighborhood commission, not the Senate, not city council, an advisory commission, the political equivalent of losing a student council election. Megan Romer's career is freelance arts and travel writing and running a small independent press called Arioso Press. Before DSA, she was a PTA volunteer and a Sunday school teacher. Lovely resume, truly. Just maybe not the guy you want holding the keys to the U.S. Treasury. Between the two of them, 0 payrolls met, 0 profit and loss statements managed, 0 budgets balanced. 0 government agencies administered, 0 businesses run, 0 companies built, 0 economies overseen at any level, anywhere, ever. That's not a resume gap. That's a resume that doesn't exist. Somewhere, a guy who ran a Chick-fil-A for 6 months is more qualified to manage a federal budget than either of these two, but sure, hand them the country. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. And it's not just them. Let's go further down the bench, because the pattern only gets funnier. John Lewis, on the National Political Committee out of New Orleans, he actually holds a master's in public administration, the one real academic credential in economic administration on the entire committee, but has never once applied it in an actual government post. So he's basically got the diploma framed on the wall next to a participation trophy. Katie Sims, an Ithaca, New York committee member, works as a digital advertising manager and ran for mayor of her city in 2022. She lost, pulling about a quarter of the vote. Ithaca said no thanks, and Ithaca is about as socialist-friendly a town as exists in America. That's like getting voted off the island on Survivor Vegan Edition. Cliff Connolly, out of Orlando, is an EMT and a substitute teacher. He also happens to be the one who spearheaded DSA's new internal security commission. And he's gone on record saying America should abolish the U.S. Senate and subordinate the presidency and the Supreme Court to Congress. An EMT running the Security Commission for an organization that wants to abolish the police. That's not irony, that's performance art. David Jenkins founded a small transcription company called Transcribblers, the single closest thing to an actual business founder anywhere on the National Committee, and it's a one-person service operation, one employee, himself. Andrew Thompson is a former Colorado State employee and union shop steward. Beyond that, the committee is rounded out by a psychiatry resident, a registered nurse, a U.S. Postal Service letter carrier, an event coordinator at a university policy institute, and an engineer. Every one of them a real job. Not one of them has ever run so much as a mid-sized company, let alone a government budget, a state economy, or anything close to what they're now asking voters to hand them. But hey, 27 people, 0 payrolls met, and yet somehow they're extremely confident about running yours. Now, here's where it gets serious, because this isn't just an internal club anymore. Zohran Mamdani is the actual mayor of New York City right now, controlling a budget over $100 billion and a workforce of roughly 300,000 people. His resume before politics? A humanities degree in Africana Studies from Bowdoin, a job as a foreclosure prevention housing counselor, and a short stint as a rapper. So the man now in charge of a $100 billion city budget used to have a rap career. We truly hope his fiscal policy is better than his flow. Katie Wilson, mayor of Seattle, a college dropout who worked as a barista, a boatyard laborer, and an apartment manager before founding a transit advocacy nonprofit. Never held office before becoming mayor, so the woman now running Seattle's city government learned budgeting by making lattes. Interesting footnote. Wilson actually courted DSA's endorsement and didn't get it, so she's a fellow traveler, not a card-carrying member. Even the socialists thought she wasn't socialist enough. That takes some doing. Janice Lewis George, on track to be the next mayor of Washington, D.C., a former prosecutor with a law degree, but again, 0 private sector or budget executive experience. Then you've got Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House, a nonprofit legal advocate and a former bartender turned Boston University economics major who never worked in the industry she studied. She has an economics degree and has never had an economics job. That's like a chef who's never actually cooked anything, just read the menu really passionately. And the new class coming up behind them, Claire Valdez, Daria Liza Avila Chevalier, Melat Kiros, union organizers, PhD students, one self-described lawyer, PhD student, and barista. At this point, just open a coffee shop, you've basically got the staff. One partial exception worth naming honestly, Pennsylvania's Chris Rabb actually wrote a book on entrepreneurship and taught business school at Temple and Drexel. He's the outlier. Everybody else's path runs from campus activism or a service job or a law degree straight into the executive branch of American cities and the halls of Congress. No stop at ran a company in between. Somewhere out there is a Fortune 500 CFO wondering why nobody asked him to run a school board. And then there's the man who arguably started all of it, Bernie Sanders. Now, to be accurate about this, Sanders is not actually a DSA member. He never has been. He's a self-described Democratic Socialist who spent his career as an independent caucusing with Democrats. And his 2016 and 2020 presidential runs are directly responsible for DSA's explosion from a few thousand members to over 100,000. So call him the movement's godfather, its figurehead, just not technically one of its members. He's like the guy who started the band but never signed the record deal. His own history is worth knowing. After graduating from the University of Chicago in 1964, Sanders bounced between jobs: carpenter, freelance writer, psychiatric hospital aide, preschool teacher. He moved to Vermont in 1968, and in the early 1970s ran 4 straight losing campaigns for governor and U.S. Senate on the ticket of the Liberty Union Party, a fringe socialist third party whose platform included nationalizing every bank in the country. 4 losses in a row. If Bernie Sanders were a sports team, they'd have fired the coach by year 2. Before politics fully took over, Sanders tried his hand at a few other things. In 1972, at 30 years old, he wrote an essay for a fringe Vermont paper called The Vermont Freeman, a stream of consciousness piece on gender roles that included a passage about a woman fantasizing about being raped by 3 men simultaneously. He's since called it bad fiction and poorly written satire aimed at gender stereotypes of the era, but it's his own words on the record from his own hand. A few years later, in 1977, he founded something called the American People's Historical Society and personally drove around New England selling homemade educational film strips to schools, a series of slides synced to audio with titles like Great Moments in Vermont History and Women of Vermont. He reportedly used a beeping walkie-talkie sound to cue the next slide. Truly cutting-edge production values. Pixar, watch your back. His biggest production was a half-hour audio slideshow on his lifelong hero, Eugene V. Debs, the socialist who ran for president from a prison cell in 1920. Vermont's own public television station wouldn't air it, so even the man widely credited as the godfather of the entire modern socialist movement in America spent most of his 30s broke, selling homemade slideshows out of his car. Somewhere in Vermont, there's a filing cabinet with Bernie's rejected Debs tape sitting right next to a participation ribbon. Sanders is one real credential, and it's a genuine one. He was mayor of Burlington, Vermont for 8 years, starting in 1981. He actually ran a city government and a city budget before ever going to Washington. That makes him the single exception on this entire list. The only figure we've covered on either side who held real executive government power and had to answer for a real budget before reaching for higher office. Bernie. Still the most qualified socialist in the room, and that room is not exactly a high bar. Now, it's one thing to talk about who's running this organization. It's another thing entirely to talk about what they actually want to do with power once they have it. And this is the part that should stop you cold. In July of this year, DSA adopted its official national platform. It's called Workers Deserve More. And buried inside it are some of the most radical proposals ever put on paper by an organization with Zohran Mamdani sitting as mayor of New York City, a presumptive mayor of the nation's capital, and a growing bloc in Congress. And it's an organization whose politics have already reached City Hall in Seattle, too. Mayor Katie Wilson isn't a DSA member, but she ran and won on the same Democratic Socialist platform, which tells you this isn't just a fringe internal document. It's the operating philosophy spreading through an entire wing of the Democratic Party. Membership card or not, the platform calls for abolishing the United States Senate entirely. It calls for eliminating the Electoral College. And it calls for replacing the President of the United States and the Supreme Court with, quote, an executive and judiciary chosen by and subordinate to Congress. Not elected by you, chosen by Congress, subordinate to Congress. Read that again. And ask yourself what that actually smells like. Because to us, that smells like oligarchy. Strip away the Senate. Strip away your vote for president. Strip away an independent judiciary. And what you're left with is a small handful of people in one single chamber, choosing the executive, choosing the judges, answerable to no other branch of government at all. And here's the thing. That's not a new outcome. Look at the history. Every time socialism or communism has actually been implemented, from the Soviet Politburo to Castro's inner circle to the Chinese Communist Party today, it hasn't ended in the classless, powerless utopia the pamphlets promise. It's ended with a small handful of the most ruthless, most powerful people running everything while everyone else does the work. That's not a bug in the system. What Say You News believes that's the actual pattern. Take away the checks, take away the balances, and power doesn't disappear. It just concentrates at the top with whoever's willing to grab it hardest. It also calls for drafting an entirely new constitution built around a single federal legislature. One chamber, no Senate to check it, no separately elected president to check it, and a judiciary that answers to it instead of the Constitution. And then there's the platform's police and prison abolition plank, a standalone provision calling for the abolition of policing and prisons in this country, on top of a broader call to abolish what the platform calls the carceral forces of the capitalist state. Not reform, not oversight, abolition, no police, no prisons. On top of that, defunding what the platform calls the Department of War. That's the Pentagon, folks. And granting amnesty to every immigrant in the country illegally. Let's just sit with that Pentagon line for a second. The DSA wants to defund the actual United States military. You know who's thrilled about that idea? Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping. They are popping champagne right now. Somewhere in Moscow and Beijing, there are strategists high-fiving thinking, wait, they're going to do this to themselves? We don't even have to invade. Just wait for the DSA platform to pass. Nothing says world peace quite like unilaterally disarming the country everyone else's adversaries are afraid of. And when they were asked about it directly, when a reporter pushed back on the idea of abolishing the United States Senate, DSA's own national co-chair, Ashik Siddiq, the same research analyst we told you about earlier, didn't walk it back. He defended it, his exact words, "We don't think that's extreme." Not extreme, abolishing a branch of government, defunding the military, and shutting down every prison in the country. It's just Tuesday for these guys. They think that's normal. No Senate, no elected president, no prisons, no police, no Pentagon. A brand new constitution written by a single chamber of Congress answerable to no one else. So ask yourself this plainly. Isn't this the destruction of the United States of America as we know it? Isn't a platform that erases the separation of powers, erases your vote for president, and erases the entire system of law enforcement, incarceration, and national defense in this country? Isn't that, by definition, the destruction of the country itself? What say you? Please like, subscribe, and share this video. If this all feels less like an accident and more like a strategy, you're onto something real. Back in 1966, two Columbia University sociologists, Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven, published a now infamous plan. Their idea, deliberately flood a government system, in their case, WALA, with more demands than it could possibly handle on purpose, until it collapsed under its own weight, break the budget, jam the bureaucracy, and in the chaos of that collapse, force a total systemic overhaul nobody would have voted for if you'd asked them outright. It's called the Cloward-Piven strategy, and what say you? You News believes we are watching a version of that same playbook today, not aimed at a welfare office anymore, but aimed at the entire American economic and constitutional system. Open borders straining every city budget. A platform that abolishes the Senate, the presidency as you know it, the prison system, and the Pentagon all at once. That's not 11 separate radical ideas. That's one strategy. Overwhelm the system until it breaks and then hand the wreckage to people who've never run so much as a lemonade stand. And remember, this particular lemonade stand comes with nuclear codes. And this isn't just our opinion. As recently as today, historian Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution published a piece called "The Socialist Monster Awakens." His argument, DSA didn't seize the Democratic Party by force. The party's own establishment radicalized itself for a decade first, and DSA simply picked up the microphone the second the old guard got too weak to hold it. Hanson's blunt assessment of who's actually in DSA's ranks: downwardly mobile, credentialed people whose degrees never delivered the income or status they expected, the same wordsmith resentment we talked about earlier, now with a name and a movement behind it. And Hanson's broader verdict on socialism itself, after a lifetime studying history, is worth hearing in full. From Stalinism to today's European welfare states, he says, socialism keeps failing. Russia and China are still digging out from genocidal communism. Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea, and Venezuela are unfree, poor, and broken. And when people inside those systems try to point out that it isn't working, history shows what happens to them. In Hanson's words, somebody always decides they need coercion and authoritarianism to shut those people up. That's where this road leads, every time. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you look at who gravitates hardest towards socialism, it's disproportionately the most credentialed people in the country. Academics, especially in the humanities and social sciences, at the most elite universities. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just what the faculty surveys show year after year. So why? There are a few serious theories, and to be fair to you, none of them are proven fact. They're competing explanations, and smart people disagree. But they're worth knowing. The philosopher Robert Nozick had a theory he called the wordsmith explanation. From grade school through grad school, the most verbally gifted kids get ranked at the top of a very formal, very legible hierarchy: grades, honors, degrees. They come to expect that being smart and articulate should determine your status in life. Then they graduate into a market economy that instead rewards risk-taking, sales, and capital allocation, skills they were never trained in and, frankly, don't always respect. So the kid who got an A+ on his gender studies thesis is baffled that the guy who owns 3 car washes makes more money than he does. Nozick's argument, a planned economy run by credentialed experts, looks to those same people like it would finally restore the hierarchy school promised them. Economist Thomas Sowell, who was a Marxist himself in his younger years, before he changed his mind, calls it the vision of the anointed. His argument, intellectuals gravitate toward believing that complex social outcomes should be centrally managed by smart, credentialed people like them, rather than left to messy, decentralized systems like markets that don't specially reward their skill set. There's also a status inconsistency theory in sociology. The idea that academics often have very high social prestige but comparatively modest income next to people with less education working in business, trades, or finance. Some researchers argue that mismatch breeds resentment toward a system that doesn't pay out what their status feels like it should be worth. In other words, PhD, no payday, deep sense of grievance. Sounds familiar. And then there's the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, no right-winger, he calls himself a centrist, whose research found that academics, especially in the social sciences, score extremely high on openness to experience and low on respect for tradition and authority. Those traits correlate strongly with left-wing and socialist sympathies, and with viewing market outcomes as illegitimate rather than earned. The more mainstream academic counter-argument, to be fair, is simpler. Educated people are exposed to more data on inequality and market failure. And their politics are just a rational response to evidence, not a psychological compensation mechanism at all. You can decide that one for yourselves. What say you? But if we're talking about credentials to run an economy, we have to go back to the source. Karl Marx, the father of it all. Here's what most people don't know or don't say out loud. Karl Marx could not run his own household budget, let alone an economy. For most of his adult life in London, Marx and his family lived in genuine poverty. Cramped, unheated rooms, unpaid debts, creditors at the door. Several of his children died young, in conditions his own family's poverty made worse. Marx himself was frequently unable to pay for basic necessities, let alone medical care. And how did he survive it all? Almost entirely on the charity of one man, Friedrich Engels. Engels wasn't a worker. He was the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer, and he ran part of his own family's capitalist business in Manchester specifically to generate the income that kept Marx and his family fed for decades. The man who wrote the founding critique of capitalism was financially rescued again and again by the profits of a factory. Karl Marx was, essentially, capitalism's first successful GoFundMe recipient. He built an entire economic theory to destroy the system that was quietly paying his rent. Think about that for a second. The single most influential document on running a planned economy in human history was written by a man who never held a job that required him to meet a payroll, balance a budget, or keep a family financially afloat, without a capitalist subsidizing him the entire time. If Karl Marx tried to open a lemonade stand, Friedrich Engels would have had to bail him out by lunchtime. So here's where What Say You News stands. Plainly, no hedging. It is our belief that socialism and communism are failed political and economic systems, not systems that were done wrong, not systems waiting for the right people to finally implement them correctly, failed systems every time they've been tried, at every scale, and we believe they cannot work because they were never built by anyone who had to prove they could run so much as a household budget in the first place. From Marx himself, dependent on a capitalist charity, straight through to the leadership of the DSA today. A research analyst, a small press publisher, a housing counselor, a college dropout, an EMT, a digital ad manager. The pattern hasn't changed in 150 years. Educated, credentialed, well-intentioned people who have never run a business, never met a payroll, never balanced anything bigger than a personal checking account. And they are now asking you to hand them the mayor's office, the governor's mansion, the halls of Congress, the Pentagon's budget, and eventually the levers of the entire United States economy. And because of how deeply intertwined America's economy is with the rest of the world, that's not just our economy on the line. That's the global economy. Somewhere, Moscow and Beijing are already rooting for them to win. We do not want people like that in charge of the economy. If they get their way, we will all be doomed. So, what say you? We've laid out the facts, we've shown you the resumes or the lack of them. Now it's your turn. What's your verdict? Please comment below, like, subscribe, and share this video.